What if there was a weapon so silent that even the man being killed could not hear the shot that took his life? What if German soldiers standing guard in the dead of night simply collapsed without warning, without sound, without any indication that death had come for them? What if the most disciplined army in the world, an army that had conquered most of Europe, was reduced to trembling terror by something they could not see, could not hear, and could not understand? Before I tell you about the Apache ghost rifle, the weapon that made hardened Nazi veterans weep with fear and beg to be transferred away from the front lines, I need you to do something for me. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from right now. Then hit that subscribe button, because this channel needs your support to keep revealing the secrets that the military buried for almost 80 years. Now let me tell you about the silence that swallowed the Third Reich. March 1944. The Italian front. The Allied campaign to liberate Europe from Nazi occupation had stalled in the mountains south of Rome, where German forces had constructed a series of defensive positions known as the Gustav Line. At the center of this line stood Monte Cassino, an ancient monastery perched atop a mountain that dominated the surrounding valleys. For 5 months, Allied forces had thrown themselves against these defenses, suffering over 50,000 casualties in some of the most brutal fighting of the entire war. The Germans seemed invincible. Their positions seemed impregnable, and every night their sentries stood watch on the mountainsides, alert to any movement, ready to call down artillery and machine gun fire on any Allied soldier foolish enough to approach. Then the sentries started dying. The first incident occurred on the night of March 12th. A German observation post overlooking the Liri Valley was manned by 4 soldiers tasked with reporting any Allied activity in the sector. At 0200 hours, a patrol from the headquarters company arrived to deliver supplies and check on the post. They found all 4 sentries dead. Each had been killed by a single gunshot wound to the head. Their bodies showed no signs of struggle. Their weapons had not been fired. Most disturbingly, none of the nearby positions had heard any shots. The observation post was less than 300 meters from a machine gun emplacement manned by 8 soldiers who had been awake all night. None of them had heard a thing. The commander of the German sector, Oberst Friedrich von Senger, initially assumed that the sentries had been killed by an infiltration team using silenced weapons. This was not unprecedented. Both sides employed commandos equipped with suppressed pistols and submachine guns for exactly this kind of work. Von Senger ordered increased security, additional patrols, and heightened alertness at all observation posts. He was confident that these measures would prevent further incidents. He was wrong. Over the next 3 weeks, 47 German soldiers were killed in identical circumstances. They died at observation posts, at checkpoint positions, at artillery spotting locations, at command bunkers. They died alone and in groups. They died at night and, in a few terrifying cases, during the daylight hours. Every victim was killed by a single shot to the head. No one ever heard the weapon that killed them, and no matter how many additional guards were posted, no matter how many patrols swept the surrounding terrain, no matter how many searchlights illuminated the darkness, the deaths continued. The psychological effect on German troops was devastating. Soldiers who had fought bravely through years of combat began to break down. They refused to stand watch. They fired at shadows. They reported seeing figures that vanished when challenged. Several units experienced mass desertions, with soldiers preferring court-martial and execution to another night, waiting for the silent death that came without warning. Morale along the entire Gustav Line began to collapse. Von Senger filed increasingly desperate reports with the German High Command, requesting reinforcements, requesting specialized counter-sniper units, requesting anything that might help him understand what was happening to his men. The response from Berlin was dismissive. The reports were exaggerated, the High Command insisted. There was no such thing as a completely silent weapon. The sentries were probably being killed by infiltrators who escaped before an alarm could be raised. Von Senger should focus on maintaining discipline and stop spreading panic through the ranks. But the killing continued, and the legend of the ghost rifle began to spread. The weapon that was terrorizing the German defenders of the Gustav Line was not, in fact, a rifle at all. It was something that defied classification, something that existed in the space between conventional weapon and supernatural phenomenon. It was carried by a single soldier, a man whose name would never appear in any official history, a man who moved through the darkness like a phantom and killed without making a sound. His name was Private First Class Raymond Geronimo Kawakla, and he was a Chiricahua Apache from the Fort Sill Apache community in Oklahoma. He was 26 years old, stood 5 feet 11 inches tall, and had been trained as a sniper at a classified facility in the Arizona desert. But unlike other snipers, whose skills could be measured and quantified, Kawakla possessed abilities that the Army's weapons specialists could not explain. Kawakla was a direct descendant of some of the most legendary Apache warriors in history. His great-grandfather had fought alongside Geronimo himself during the final years of the Apache Wars. His grandfather had been a medicine man of considerable reputation, known throughout the Apache community for his ability to communicate with the spirit world. And his father had served as a scout for the United States Army during the punitive expedition against Pancho Villa in 1916. Demonstrating tracking abilities that his commanding officers described as almost supernatural. Raymond Kawakla had inherited all of this. He had been trained from childhood in the traditional Apache ways of warfare, learning techniques that had been passed down through countless generations. He could move through any terrain without making a sound. He could remain motionless for hours, invisible even to observers who were looking directly at him. He could sense the presence of enemies before he saw them, feeling their location through some faculty that had no name in the English language. But his most remarkable ability was connected to the weapon he carried. It was a modified Springfield M1903, the standard American sniper rifle of the era. The modifications, however, were unlike anything in the Army's inventory. The barrel had been shortened and wrapped in leather that had been treated with substances whose composition was never recorded in any document. The stock had been carved with symbols that Army ordnance officers did not recognize and could not translate. And the firing mechanism had been altered in ways that violated every principle of ballistic engineering. The rifle should not have functioned at all. The modifications should have made it completely inoperable. And yet, when Kawakla pulled the trigger, the weapon fired without making any sound whatsoever. Not a muffled sound, not a suppressed sound, no sound at all. The bullet left the barrel in complete silence, traveled to its target in complete silence, and struck its victim in complete silence. Even the impact made no noise that human ears could detect. The Army's weapons specialists spent months trying to understand how this was possible. They examined the rifle. They tested the ammunition. They measured everything that could be measured. Their conclusion, buried in a classified report that was not declassified until 2011, was both simple and profound. They wrote, "The weapon designated Ghost Rifle 1 operates through mechanisms that cannot be explained by currently understood principles of physics. Sound waves that should be generated by the firing process are not merely suppressed, but apparently eliminated at the source. The projectile maintains accuracy and lethality despite modifications that should render the weapon non-functional. No conventional explanation for these phenomena has been identified. The modifications to the rifle had been performed by Kawakla's grandfather, a medicine man named Joseph Kawakla, who was in his 80s when the war began. Joseph Kawakla had been brought to the classified training facility in Arizona as a consultant, officially to advise on Apache cultural practices that might enhance soldier performance. Unofficially, he had been asked to do something that the Army's bureaucracy could never formally acknowledge. He had been asked to make weapons that operated outside the laws of physics. Joseph Kewekler agreed to help, but only under certain conditions. He would work only with his grandson. He would modify only one weapon, and the knowledge of how the modification was performed would never be recorded or shared with anyone outside the Apache tradition. The army, desperate for any advantage in the grinding war against the Axis powers, accepted these conditions. What Joseph Kewekler did to that rifle during the 3 weeks he spent at the Arizona facility was witnessed by no one. He worked alone in a specially constructed building, its windows covered, its doors locked. Guards reported hearing him singing in the Apache language for hours at a time. They reported strange lights flickering beneath the door. They reported sounds that could not have come from any natural source, sounds that one guard described as voices speaking from somewhere very far away. When Joseph Kewekler finally emerged from the building, he was exhausted but satisfied. He handed the rifle to his grandson and said only one thing: "It will not miss, and they will not hear it coming." Raymond Kewekler was deployed to Italy in February 1944, attached to a special operations unit that officially did not exist. His mission was simple in concept, but almost impossible in execution. He was to infiltrate German lines alone, identify and eliminate high-value targets, and return without being detected. He was given no support, no backup, no extraction plan. He was simply pointed at the enemy and told to do what his ancestors had done for centuries. His first mission was a test, designed to evaluate whether the Ghost rifle actually worked as advertised. He was tasked with eliminating a German officer whose command post was located in a farmhouse approximately 2 miles behind the front lines. The post was surrounded by guards, illuminated by searchlights, and protected by multiple layers of security. A conventional sniper would have needed to get within 300 yards to make the shot, a distance that would have been impossible to achieve undetected. Kewekler made the shot from over 1,200 yards away at night, through a narrow window that was partially obscured by curtains. The officer died instantly. None of the guards heard anything. None of the security measures were triggered. The death was not discovered until the next morning, when a staff officer entered the room to deliver a report and found his commander slumped over his desk with a bullet hole precisely between his eyes. The after-action report on this mission was written by Colonel Marcus Webb, the commander of the Special Operations Unit to which Kewekler was assigned. Webb was a career military officer with no patience for superstition or exaggeration. His reports were known for their dry precision and careful documentation, but his account of Kewekler's first mission contains passages that reveal his growing unease with what he was witnessing. Webb wrote, "The subject completed the assigned mission with complete success. Target was eliminated without alerting security forces. No indication of American presence was detected by enemy personnel. However, I must note several aspects of this operation that I find difficult to explain. The shooting distance exceeded the effective range of the subject's weapon by a factor of at least 3. Lighting conditions should have made target acquisition impossible, and the complete absence of any audible report from the weapon discharge remains unexplained, despite extensive investigation. I am recommending that subject be deployed for additional missions pending further evaluation of these anomalous capabilities." Over the next 2 months, Kewekler conducted over 30 missions behind German lines. He killed colonels and majors and captains. He eliminated artillery observers whose deaths blinded entire divisions. He assassinated Gestapo officers who had been coordinating the deportation of Italian Jews to concentration camps. And he did all of this in complete silence, leaving behind no evidence except the bodies of his victims and the growing terror of the German soldiers who could not understand what was happening to them. The legend of the Ghost rifle spread through the German ranks like a virus. Soldiers whispered about it in their bunkers. Officers discussed it in hushed tones at staff meetings. Chaplains were overwhelmed by men who believed they were being stalked by supernatural forces. The official position of the German command was that the deaths were the result of conventional sniper activity combined with hysteria and poor discipline. But privately, even the most rational German officers were beginning to wonder. Sturmbannführer Wilhelm Kastner was an SS intelligence officer assigned to investigate the mysterious deaths along the Gustav Line. Kastner was a former criminal investigator from Munich, trained in forensic analysis and known for his methodical approach to problem-solving. He arrived in Italy in April 1944 with orders to identify the source of the silent killings and develop countermeasures. What Kastner discovered over the following weeks destroyed his confidence in everything he thought he knew about the world. His investigation began with the forensic evidence. He examined the bodies of over 24 victims, documenting wound patterns and bullet trajectories. What he found made no sense. The bullets that killed these men did not behave like normal projectiles. Their trajectories did not account for wind drift or gravitational drop. Some bullets appeared to have traveled in perfectly straight lines over distances where such trajectories were physically impossible. Others seemed to have changed direction in flight, curving around obstacles to reach their targets. Kastner also noticed something else. The entry wounds were unusually clean, with none of the tearing and fragmentation that typically accompanied rifle bullet impacts. The bullets seemed to pass through flesh and bone with an almost surgical precision, causing death instantaneously but leaving minimal collateral damage. It was as if the projectiles were guided by some intelligence, some force that ensured they struck exactly where they needed to strike and nowhere else. In his preliminary report dated April 23, 1944, Kastner wrote, "The evidence I have gathered suggests that we are dealing with something that lies outside the boundaries of conventional warfare. The weapon or weapons responsible for these deaths do not operate according to known ballistic principles. The shooter or shooters responsible demonstrate capabilities that exceed normal human performance by a significant margin. I am forced to consider the possibility that we are facing some form of advanced technology or technique that German science does not currently understand." Kastner requested additional resources to continue his investigation. He asked for physicists who could analyze the ballistic anomalies. He asked for psychologists who could interview survivors and assess the psychological impact of the killings. He asked for anthropologists who could research American indigenous cultures and their traditions of warfare. Most of his requests were denied. The German war machine was stretched to its limits, fighting on multiple fronts, and had no resources to spare for what many in the high command still considered a minor disciplinary problem. But one request was granted. Kastner was given access to a prisoner, an American soldier, who had been captured during a reconnaissance mission near the Anzio beachhead. The soldier was a private first class from New Mexico, a member of a unit that German intelligence had flagged as potentially connected to the mysterious sniper activity. His name was Thomas Red Cloud, and he was a Jicarilla Apache. Red Cloud was not directly connected to K. Wakeler or the Ghost Rifle program, but he knew things, he had heard stories, and under interrogation he said things that would haunt Kastner for the rest of his life. The interrogation took place over 3 days in a basement cell in Rome. Kastner employed every technique in his considerable repertoire, from psychological manipulation to physical coercion. Red Cloud resisted for the first 2 days, giving only his name, rank, and serial number. But on the 3rd day, weakened by lack of sleep and constant pressure, he began to talk. What he said was not what Kastner expected. Red Cloud did not reveal military secrets or operational details. Instead, he spoke about his people, about their history, about the traditions that had been passed down through generations of Apache warriors. He spoke about the old ways of warfare, about techniques that the white man had never understood and could never replicate. And he spoke about something that made Kastner's blood run cold. Red Cloud said, "You want to know why your men are dying without a sound? I will tell you, it is because we have called upon the old ones, the spirits of our ancestors who fought against the Bluecoats, who died defending our homeland, who never surrendered even when everything was lost. They are with us now. They guide our bullets. They silence our weapons. They make us invisible to our enemies. You cannot fight them. You cannot stop them. They have been waiting for this moment for 100 years, waiting for the chance to prove that they were never defeated, that they will never be defeated. Your men are dying because the old ones have decided that they must die, and there is nothing you can do about it." Kastner dismissed this as primitive superstition, the desperate ramblings of a broken prisoner trying to intimidate his captors. But the words stayed with him. They echoed in his mind as he continued his investigation, and slowly, against every instinct of his rational, educated, scientific worldview, he began to wonder if the Apache prisoner had been telling the truth. The evidence was accumulating in ways that could not be explained by conventional means. A German sniper team, positioned to counter the mysterious shooter, had been eliminated one by one over the course of a single night. Each man had been killed by a single shot to the head. Their bodies were found in their hiding positions, their rifles still aimed at the American lines, their eyes still open as if they had never seen what killed them. The team leader, a decorated veteran with over 200 confirmed kills, had been shot through his own rifle scope, the bullet traveling down the optical tube and into his eye with a precision that seemed almost mocking. Another incident involved a general who had come to the front to boost morale. General Major Ernst von Witzleben had arrived at a forward command post in an armored vehicle, surrounded by a security detail of over 20 men. He had entered the bunker, sat down at the command table, and begun to review situation reports. Less than 3 minutes later, he was dead, killed by a single bullet that had somehow penetrated the bunker's concrete walls, passed through 2 rooms, and struck him in the left temple while he was reading a document about troop movements in the Leary Valley. None of his security detail had heard anything. The hole in the wall was less than an inch in diameter and showed no signs of explosive or armor-piercing penetration. Kastner visited the bunker where von Witzleben had died. He measured the trajectory of the shot. He calculated the angles and distances, and he reached a conclusion that he could never put in any official report. The shot was impossible. The bullet would have had to travel over 2,000 meters, penetrate multiple physical barriers, and strike a moving target with perfect accuracy. No rifle in existence could do this. No technology the Germans had ever encountered could do this. Something else was at work. Something that operated according to rules that Kastner did not understand. In his personal diary, which was recovered after the war and is now held in the archives of the German Federal Military Archive in Freiburg, Kastner wrote an entry dated May 2nd, 1944, that reveals his growing desperation. He wrote, "I am a man of science. I have built my career on evidence and logic, but the evidence I am gathering defies logic. The deaths continue, our countermeasures fail, and I am left with no explanation except the one offered by the Apache prisoner, an explanation that my rational mind refuses to accept, but that my experience is making increasingly difficult to deny. I'm beginning to believe that we are fighting against something older than our science, something that was ancient when our civilization was young, something that does not care about our weapons or our tactics or our superior numbers. Something that has already decided that we will lose." Kastner's investigation was terminated in late May, when the Allies finally broke through the Gustav Line, and the German forces began their retreat northward. The Ghost Rifle continued its work throughout the retreat, eliminating officers and specialists whose deaths accelerated the German collapse. But Kastner never completed his report. He never identified the shooter, and he never developed the countermeasures he had been tasked with creating. He survived the war and lived until 1972, dying in Munich at the age of 68. His personal effects included dozens of notebooks filled with observations about the ghost rifle investigation, observations that he had never shared with anyone during his lifetime. In the final entry, dated just weeks before his death, he wrote something that suggests he never stopped thinking about what happened in Italy nearly 30 years earlier. He wrote, "I have spent my entire life trying to understand what I witnessed on the Gustav line. I have read everything I could find about American indigenous peoples and their spiritual traditions. I have consulted with academics and researchers, and even in secret, with practitioners of what they call the old ways. And I have reached a conclusion that brings me no comfort. The Apache were telling the truth. They had called upon forces that our civilization has forgotten or chosen to ignore, forces that are older than history, forces that do not forget and do not forgive. I was on the wrong side of that war, not just politically or militarily, but spiritually. And somewhere in a realm I cannot see but have come to believe exists, those forces are still watching, still waiting, still keeping count of the debts that remain unpaid. The ghost rifle itself was never recovered. Raymond Kaiwekla completed over 50 missions during the Italian campaign, killing an estimated 130 German soldiers before he was extracted and reassigned to the Pacific Theater. What happened to him after the war remains unclear. Official records show that he was honorably discharged in 1945 and returned to the Fort Sill Apache community in Oklahoma. After that, the records go silent. But stories persist among the Apache people. Stories of a man who returned from the war and retreated into the mountains, living alone, speaking to no one, communing with spirits that only he could see. Stories of strange lights in the wilderness at night, of sounds that could not be explained, of a presence that watched over the land with ancient knowing eyes. Stories of a rifle that was buried somewhere in those mountains, still loaded, still ready, still waiting for the day when it would be needed again. These stories have never been verified. They exist only in the oral traditions of the Apache people, passed down from generation to generation like all their sacred knowledge. But the people who tell these stories believe them. They believe that Raymond Kaiwekla never truly came home from the war. They believe that part of him stayed behind, merged with the old ones he had called upon to guide his bullets. They believe that the ghost rifle is not just a weapon, but a doorway, a connection between the world of the living and the world of the ancestors. And they believe that someday, when the need is great enough, that doorway will open again. The war ended, but the mystery of the ghost rifle did not. In the chaos of victory, as millions of soldiers returned home and the machinery of war ground to a halt, a small group of men within the American military establishment worked frantically to preserve and understand what Raymond Kaiwekla had accomplished. They understood that the ghost rifle represented something unprecedented, something that could change the nature of warfare forever, and they were terrified that this knowledge might be lost. The man leading this effort was Colonel Marcus Webb, the same officer who had commanded the Special Operations Unit to which Kaiwekla was attached. Webb had witnessed things during the Italian campaign that had shattered his understanding of what was possible. He had seen reports of kills at distances that exceeded the physical capabilities of any known weapon. He had examined bullet trajectories that violated the laws of physics, and he had met Raymond Kaiwekla, had looked into the young Apache's eyes and seen something there that he could not name but could never forget. In August 1945, Webb submitted a classified proposal to the War Department requesting the establishment of a research program to study the ghost rifle and related phenomena. The proposal was titled Project Silent Thunder, and it outlined an ambitious plan to understand, document, and ultimately replicate the capabilities that Kaiwekla had demonstrated. Webb argued that the United States was entering a new era of global competition, that the Soviet Union would soon emerge as a formidable adversary, and that any technological advantage, no matter how unconventional, must be preserved and developed. The proposal was approved in October 1945, with funding allocated from the same secret budgets that would later support the Manhattan Project's successor programs. Webb was given command of a research facility in the New Mexico desert, not far from the Apache reservations, where many of the war's indigenous soldiers had originated. He was authorized to recruit scientists, intelligence officers, and consultants with relevant expertise. And he was given one primary objective: locate Raymond K. Wakeler and the Ghost Rifle and bring them both to the facility for study. This proved far more difficult than anyone anticipated. K. Wakeler had been discharged from the Army in September 1945, processed through a separation center in California, along with thousands of other returning veterans. His discharge papers listed his destination as Lawton, Oklahoma, the nearest town to the Fort Sill Apache community where his family lived. But when Army investigators arrived in Lawton in November, they found no trace of him. His family claimed they had not seen him since before the war. Neighbors said he had never returned to the community. Tribal officials expressed confusion at the Army's interest in a single veteran among the thousands who were coming home. Everyone the investigators spoke with seemed genuinely unaware of Kai Wakeler's whereabouts. And yet, there were hints that something was being hidden. An elderly woman, a distant relative of Kai Wakeler's grandmother, told one investigator something that was not included in the official report. She said that Raymond had come home, but not in the way people usually come home. She said he had appeared to his grandfather Joseph in a dream, speaking from a place that was neither here nor there, a place between the world of the living and the world of the spirits. She said Joseph had wept when he woke from this dream, wept with joy and sorrow mixed together, and had gone into the mountains the next day to perform a ceremony that lasted for 7 days. When he returned, he told no one what had happened, but from that day forward, he never spoke Raymond's name again. The investigators dismissed this as superstition, the confused ramblings of an old woman who did not understand what they were asking. But Colonel Webb, when he read the report, circled this passage and wrote in the margin, "This may be the most important information we have gathered. The grandfather knows something. We must find him." Joseph K. Wakeler was located in January 1946, living in a remote cabin in the Wichita Mountains of southwestern Oklahoma. He was 93 years old, frail but mentally sharp, and he received the Army's representatives with a courtesy that masked complete unwillingness to cooperate. When they asked about his grandson, he said only that Raymond was at peace. When they asked about the rifle, he said it was where it needed to be. When they asked if he would help them understand how the weapon worked, he looked at them with eyes that seemed to see through flesh and bone into the essence of their souls. And he said something that one of the investigators would remember for the rest of his life. Joseph K. Wakeler said, "You want to use what I know to kill more people. You want to take the old ways and make them serve your wars. But the old ways do not serve anyone. They are not tools to be used and discarded. They are relationships. They are covenants. They are agreements between the living and the dead that cannot be broken without consequences." My grandson understood this. He gave himself to the old ones so that your soldiers could live and the enemy could die. It was a sacred exchange, a sacrifice that you cannot comprehend. And now you come here asking me to betray that sacrifice, to hand over secrets that were purchased with my grandson's soul. The answer is no. It will always be no. And if you try to force me, you will learn that the old ones protect their own. The investigators left empty-handed. Joseph K. Wakeler died 3 months later, taking his secrets with him. His body was buried in a location that was never recorded in any official document. The Ghost Rifle was never found, and Project Silent Thunder, despite years of effort and millions of dollars in funding, never succeeded in replicating what Raymond K. Wakeler had achieved. But the project did not fail completely. Over the years, researchers managed to gather fragments of information, pieces of a puzzle that they could never fully assemble. They interviewed other Apache veterans who had served in the war, gathering hints about traditional practices and spiritual beliefs. They studied the reports from the Italian campaign, analyzing every detail of Kaiwakla's missions. They consulted with anthropologists and historians who had documented Apache culture before it was disrupted by European colonization. And slowly, painfully, they began to develop a theory about how the ghost rifle might have worked. The theory was never formally published. It exists only in classified documents that were partially declassified in 2015, with significant portions still redacted for reasons of national security. But the portions that are available reveal a fascinating and disturbing attempt to understand something that lies far outside the boundaries of conventional science. The lead researcher on the theoretical work was Dr. Eleanor Whitfield, a physicist who had worked on radar technology during the war and had been recruited to Project Silent Thunder in 1947. Whitfield was initially skeptical of the entire enterprise, viewing the reports of silent, impossibly accurate gunfire as exaggerations or misunderstandings. But as she examined the evidence, her skepticism began to erode. The key insight came from her analysis of the modified rifle that had been used by a different Apache soldier, not Kaiwakla, but a man named Franklin Chatto, who had served in the Pacific Theater. Chatto's rifle had been recovered after his death on Okinawa, and though it was not identical to Kaiwakla's ghost rifle, it had been modified in similar ways by an Apache medicine man before deployment. Whitfield examined this rifle with every instrument at her disposal. She measured its physical properties. She tested its ballistic performance. She analyzed the materials used in its modification, and she found something that she could not explain through any conventional means. The rifle seemed to exist in two states simultaneously. When measured by one set of instruments, it displayed normal physical properties, consistent with a standard military weapon. But when measured by a different set of instruments, particularly those designed to detect electromagnetic anomalies, it displayed properties that were completely impossible. It appeared to be connected to something, as if invisible threads extended from the weapon into a dimension that Whitfield's instruments could not directly perceive. Whitfield developed a hypothesis that she called quantum entanglement amplification. She proposed that the modifications made by the Apache medicine men had somehow created a connection between the physical weapon and what she cautiously termed a non-local field of consciousness. This field, she theorized, was what the Apache called the spirit world, the realm where ancestors resided and from which they could influence events in the material world. The modifications to the rifle had essentially turned it into an antenna, capable of receiving guidance from this non-local field and translating that guidance into physical effects such as silent firing and impossible accuracy. This hypothesis was never proven. The instruments needed to test it did not exist and may still not exist today. But Whitfield's theoretical framework became the foundation for decades of subsequent research that extended far beyond the ghost rifle into broader questions about consciousness, physics, and the nature of reality itself. Project Silent Thunder was officially terminated in 1954, its researchers reassigned to other programs, its files archived and forgotten. But the questions it raised did not go away. They migrated into other classified programs with code names that have never been declassified, programs that may still be operating today in facilities that officially do not exist. And the legend of the ghost rifle continued to grow. Among the Apache people, Raymond Kaiwakla became a figure of almost mythical significance. Stories about him multiplied and evolved, blending historical fact with spiritual interpretation until it became impossible to separate one from the other. Some stories said he had become a spirit himself, merging with the old ones who had guided his bullets during the war. Others said he was still alive, living in a hidden place between worlds, waiting for the day when his people would need him again. Still others said the ghost rifle was not a weapon at all, but a teaching, a lesson about the power of faith and connection and sacrifice that had been encoded in the form of a gun so that the white man's military could understand it. One story, told by an elder named Margaret Yellowhorse to a researcher in 1987, provides a particularly haunting account of what may have happened to Kay Wakeler after the war. Yellowhorse claimed that her grandmother had been present when Joseph K. Wakeler performed the ceremony in the mountains after receiving his grandson's dream visitation. According to Yellowhorse, the ceremony was not a funeral or a memorial, but something far more profound. It was a completion, a fulfillment of the covenant that Raymond had made with the old ones when he first picked up the ghost rifle. Yellowhorse said, "When Raymond agreed to carry that rifle, he agreed to become part of it. Not just a man holding a weapon, but a single being, a channel through which the old ones could act in the world. Every time he pulled the trigger, he gave a piece of himself to the spirits. Every German he killed, a part of Raymond, went with the bullet into the darkness. By the end of the war, there was not enough of him left to come back. His body was still walking, still breathing, but the essence of who he was had already crossed over. The ceremony in the mountains was Joseph saying goodbye to his grandson and welcoming him into the company of the ancestors. Raymond did not die. He completed a journey that had begun the moment the old ones first spoke through his rifle. This story cannot be verified. Margaret Yellowhorse died in 1992, and she never spoke publicly about what her grandmother had witnessed. But her account is consistent with other stories that have been collected from the Apache community over the decades, stories that suggest Raymond K. Wakeler achieved something that very few human beings have ever achieved. He became a bridge between worlds, a permanent connection between the living and the dead, a channel through which the power of the ancestors could flow into the material realm. If this is true, then the ghost rifle was not simply a weapon. It was a sacrament, a sacrifice, a doorway that remained open long after the war ended. But there is another dimension to this story, a darker dimension that must be confronted. Because while the Apache tell stories of spiritual completion and ancestral honor, the evidence suggests that the American military's interest in the ghost rifle did not end with Project Silent Thunder. The evidence suggests that attempts to replicate and weaponize the phenomenon continued for decades, attempts that caused immense suffering and may have unleashed forces that could not be controlled. The first indication of these continuing efforts came in 1963, when a young anthropologist named Dr. Michael Clearwater was conducting fieldwork on the Mescalero Apache Reservation in New Mexico. Clearwater was researching traditional healing practices, but he kept encountering references to something else, something that the elders were reluctant to discuss. They spoke of government men who came in the night, asking questions, taking people away, conducting experiments that left their subjects broken and empty. Clearwater eventually pieced together a disturbing picture. Beginning in the late 1950s, agents from an unnamed government agency had been recruiting young Apache men for a classified program. The recruits were told they would be serving their country, continuing the proud tradition of Apache military service. They were taken to a facility somewhere in the Nevada desert, a facility that some of them described as being underground, hidden from the sky, surrounded by fences and guards who never spoke. What happened at this facility was never fully documented. But the men who returned, those who returned at all, were changed. They spoke of ceremonies conducted by people who did not understand what they were doing, of attempts to force connections with spirits who had not consented to be contacted, of rituals that went wrong in ways that defied description. Several of the returnees suffered severe psychological breakdowns. Others developed physical ailments that no doctor could diagnose. A few simply disappeared. Their families told they had died in training accidents. Their bodies never returned. One of these men, a veteran named Robert Goodluck, gave a statement to Clearwater that was so disturbing the anthropologist never published it. Goodluck had been recruited in 1961 at the age of 22. He spent 8 months at the underground facility before being released. When Clearwater interviewed him in 1963, Goodluck was living alone in a cabin on the edge of the reservation, rarely venturing out, speaking to almost no one. Goodluck told Clearwater that the government researchers were trying to recreate the ghost rifle. They had obtained fragments of the original weapon, pieces that had somehow been recovered from the mountains of Oklahoma. They had documents from Project Silent Thunder, and they had Apache recruits whom they believed could be trained to channel the same forces that Raymond K. Wakeler had channeled during the war. The training was brutal. Recruits were subjected to sensory deprivation, psychedelic drugs, and rituals adapted from Apache traditions by researchers who had no understanding of their true meaning. They were forced to hold the fragments of the ghost rifle while government shamans, men who had learned Apache ceremonies from books and recordings rather than from living teachers, attempted to establish contact with the spirit world. Goodluck said they did not know what they were doing. They thought the power was in the rituals, in the words and the movements and the objects. They did not understand that the power comes from relationship, from generations of connection between the living and the dead. You cannot fake that, you cannot force that, and when you try, the spirits do not answer, or worse, something else answers. Something else did answer. Goodluck described experiences that he struggled to put into words. Encounters with presences that were not the benevolent ancestors of Apache tradition, but something older, something hungry, something that had been waiting in the darkness for an opportunity to enter the world. These presences attached themselves to the recruits, feeding on their fear and confusion, driving some of them to madness. The facility was closed in 1964. After an incident that Goodluck refused to describe, except to say that several researchers died and the underground complex was permanently sealed. The surviving recruits were released, sworn to secrecy, and monitored for the rest of their lives. Most of them died young, from suicide or accidents or mysterious illnesses. Goodluck himself lived until 1978. When he was found dead in his cabin, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror, his hands clutching a crucifix that he had not owned the day before. The cross was never explained. Goodluck had not been a Christian. He had maintained traditional Apache beliefs throughout his life, but someone or something had placed that crucifix in his hands in his final moments. Some who knew him believed it was a sign of protection, a last-minute intervention by a power that opposed whatever had come for him. Others believed it was a message, a statement that even the old ones recognized there were forces beyond their understanding, forces that required a different kind of faith to confront. Dr. Clearwater published some of his findings in an obscure academic journal in 1971, carefully omitting the most disturbing details. His article attracted little attention at the time. But in 2008, a researcher named Dr. Sandra Whitehorse, herself a member of the Navajo Nation, came across Clearwater's work and began her own investigation. Whitehorse spent 5 years gathering evidence about the post-war experiments. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests. She interviewed elderly Apache who remembered the government recruiters. She tracked down the families of men who had been taken to the underground facility, and she uncovered documents that confirmed the worst of what Clearwater had discovered. The program that recruited Robert Goodluck and the others was codenamed Project Ghostwalker. It operated from 1958 to 1964, when it was abruptly terminated following what the documents call a catastrophic containment failure. The exact nature of this failure was redacted from every document Whitehorse obtained, but marginal notes in one file, apparently written by a researcher who was present during the incident, provide a chilling hint. The note reads, "We opened a door that we could not close. They came through. They are still coming through. God help us all." Whitehorse published her findings in 2013 in a book titled Stolen Spirits: The Secret History of Government Experiments on Native Americans. The book received some media attention, primarily in Native American publications and alternative history forums, but mainstream outlets largely ignored it, dismissing its claims as conspiracy theories unsupported by verifiable evidence. What the mainstream outlets did not know, what Whitehorse herself did not discover until after her book was published, was that Project Ghostwalker had a successor, and that successor was still operating. In 2015, Whitehorse received an anonymous package at her office at the University of New Mexico. The package contained a USB drive with encrypted files and a handwritten note that said only, "They never stopped." The drive also contained a key to decrypt the files, hidden in a sequence of numbers that Whitehorse eventually recognized as coordinates for a location in the Nevada desert. The files documented a program called Project Spectre, which had been initiated in 1983 and was apparently still active as of 2014, the most recent date in the documents. Project Spectre was described as a continuation of research into non-local consciousness phenomena with applications for advanced weapons systems. The documents referenced the Ghost Rifle, Project Silent Thunder, and Project Ghostwalker. They described ongoing experiments with indigenous subjects, primarily Apache and Navajo, who had been recruited through methods that the documents delicately called enhanced persuasion protocols. Most disturbing of all, the documents described something that the researchers called the breach. This was apparently a permanent opening between the material world and what the documents termed the non-local consciousness field, an opening that had been created during the Ghostwalker incident in 1964 and had never been successfully closed. The breach was described as stable but expanding, requiring constant monitoring and containment measures that consumed significant resources. The documents expressed concern that the breach might eventually grow beyond the capacity of current containment technology. Whitehorse attempted to verify these documents through conventional channels. She contacted the Department of Defense, the CIA, and various other agencies that might have been involved in such a program. All of them denied any knowledge of Project Spectre or the other programs mentioned in the files. When she visited the coordinates indicated in the note, she found only empty desert, with no indication that any facility had ever existed there. But she also found something else. Near the coordinates, in a wash that had been carved by centuries of flash floods, she discovered a fragment of metal that appeared to be part of a rifle barrel. The metal was old and corroded, but still recognizable, and carved into its surface, barely visible beneath the rust and decay, were symbols that Whitehorse recognized as traditional Apache ceremonial markings. She took the fragment to an expert in Apache material culture, an elder named Thomas Bighorse, who had spent his life preserving traditional knowledge. Bighorse examined the fragment for a long time in silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. He said, "This is from the gun. The Ghost Rifle. I've heard stories about it all my life. My grandmother's brother served with the man who carried it, though he would never speak the man's name. She told me that the rifle was not made but grown, not modified but awakened. She said it was alive in a way that white people could not understand. And she said that when the war ended, it was taken apart and scattered, buried in different places so that it could never be reassembled." He paused, turning the fragment over in his weathered hands. Then he said something that made Whitehorse's blood run cold. He said, "But the stories also say that the rifle wants to be whole again. It calls to its pieces across time and distance. It calls to the one who carried it, wherever he is now. And someday, when the need is great enough, it will reassemble itself. The pieces will find each other, the spirit will reawaken, and the ghost rifle will speak again. Whitehorse left the fragment with Bighorse, who said he would give it a proper burial in a place that the old ones would protect. She returned to her university and continued her research, but the anonymous source never contacted her again. The encrypted files remained her only evidence of Project Spectre, evidence that no official source would confirm or deny. She published her findings in an updated edition of her book in 2017. She gave interviews to anyone who would listen. She testified before a congressional subcommittee investigating government experiments on indigenous peoples. But nothing changed. The programs, if they still existed, continued to operate in the shadows. The breach, if it was real, continued to expand. And somewhere in the Nevada desert, or in underground facilities that did not appear on any map, researchers may still be attempting to harness forces that they do not understand. The story of the ghost rifle is a story about power. It is a story about the power of faith, of connection, of sacrifice. It is a story about what happens when that power is respected, channeled through proper relationships, guided by wisdom that has been accumulated over countless generations. And it is a story about what happens when that power is disrespected, stolen, exploited by people who see it only as a tool to be used for their own purposes. Raymond K. Wakeler understood the difference. He gave himself to the old ones willingly, with full knowledge of what he was sacrificing. He became part of the ghost rifle because he chose to, because his people needed him to, because the enemy they faced was so evil that any sacrifice was justified to stop it. His gift was sacred, his sacrifice was holy, and the power that flowed through him was power that had been freely given by ancestors who loved their descendant and trusted him to use their gift wisely. The government researchers who came after did not understand this. They saw only the results, the silent kills, the impossible accuracy. They wanted to replicate these results without replicating the conditions that made them possible. They wanted the power without the relationship. They wanted the harvest without the planting. And in their arrogance they opened doors that should have remained closed, awakened forces that should have remained sleeping, created breaches between worlds that may never be healed. This is the lesson of the ghost rifle. This is what the silence that swallowed the Third Reich has to teach us. Power that comes from a sacred source must be treated with sacred respect. Traditions that have been preserved for generations contain wisdom that cannot be extracted through experiments and protocols. And there are forces in this universe, forces older than nations and armies and wars, that do not take kindly to those who try to use them without permission. Turn to God, turn to Jesus Christ. In their infinite wisdom, they understand what the Apache have always understood, that true power comes from relationship, from love, from willing sacrifice. The same faith that made the ghost rifle possible is available to all of us, not to make weapons of war, but to make ourselves instruments of peace. The same connection to the divine that guided Raymond K. Wakeler's bullets can guide us through the darkness of our own lives if we are willing to humble ourselves and ask for help. The old ones are still watching. The ancestors have not forgotten. And somewhere, in a realm that we cannot see but that is as real as the ground beneath our feet, the spirit of Raymond K. Wakeler stands among his forefathers, looking out at the world he helped to save, waiting to see what we will do with the freedom he purchased with his very soul. Remember him, honor him, learn from his sacrifice. The ghost rifle was not just a weapon, it was a testament to what is possible when human beings align themselves with powers greater than themselves. It was proof that the material world is not all there is, that there are dimensions of reality that science has yet to acknowledge, that the wisdom of indigenous peoples is not primitive superstition, but profound truth. And it was a warning. A warning about what happens when that truth is disrespected. A warning about the consequences of trying to steal what can only be given. A warning that the silence of the ghost rifle can become a different kind of silence. A silence of judgment, a silence of reckoning. A silence that swallows not just enemy sentries, but entire civilizations that have lost their way. Listen to the silence. Hear what it has to tell you. And never forget the Apache warrior who walked into the darkness, carrying a rifle that did not make a sound, serving powers that did not ask for glory, giving everything he had so that others might live. His sacrifice continues, his spirit endures, and the ghost rifle is still waiting, waiting for the day when it will be needed again, waiting for someone worthy to carry it, waiting in silence, always in silence. The question is whether you are listening. The ancestors certainly are, and they never miss.